One of the tools in learning web development is a sample API, something you can test your front end against. In this course, we're going to build a sample API that can be used both locally and via the web. Along the way, we'll learn how to build and deploy a minimal API in C#. When we're done, we'll have built an API with sample data that is documented, has health checks, simulates slowdowns and errors, and is deployed both as a Docker container as well as a web application on a virtual private server. The end result will be a tool you can use in testing for your own apps. In this lesson, we're going to set up our API and configure Scalar to be our API documentation page. So let's get started. Here we have Visual Studio. I'm using VS 2022 Community Edition. So let's create a new project, and we're going to create an API project, an ASP.NET Core Web API project type. Now, we're going to call this application the sample API. And we'll call this the sample API app. So we're going to call it the sample API because that's the domain name we'll end up giving this project. So let's go to next. We're going to say .NET 9. We're not going to add authentication. We may come back and do that later, or at least a simulation of authentication. We'll see. But for right now, we're going to leave authentication off. That way, you don't have to negotiate authentication in order to just get your sample data. Now, we're not going to enable container support. We're going to do that ourselves later. We are going to enable Open API support. If you watch the video on YouTube where we talk about the different replacements for Swagger, Open API is the kind of back end for Swagger, but you still have to put a UI on that. We're going to do that in this video. We are not going to use controllers. We're not going to add Aspire orchestration. We're going to keep this pretty simple. All right. So you hit create. And once we do, we'll have our API. And there's a few things I want to start tweaking. So first off, we're going to get rid of this .http file. We don't need it right now. We can add it back later if we want it. Next up, we're going to start tackling this file. I'm going to clean up kind of some of the stuff that's just laying around here that I don't think we need to have these code comments. I also don't think we need to have this, but we're going to wait to get rid of the weather forecast until after we have added our Scalar. Then we can see Scalar in action, and then we'll go ahead and delete the sample data. All right, so this is our API start. Let's add Scalar first, and then we'll come back and tweak how we want to address this sample data. So let's start by going to dependencies and say manage NuGet packages. And we're going to search for Scalar. And we get this Scalar.ASP.NET Core. The version right now is 2.0.26. If your version's later, that's fine. And once that's installed, we can come down here and say app.map Scalar. Let's spell it right since I didn't add the using directive. Scalar API reference. And control dot to add the using Scalar.ASP.NET Core. Then we're going to say, let's leave it alone for now. We're going to just have it be the basic Scalar setup. We're going to tweak the configuration here. We're not going to leave it default, but let's start right here. We're just going to start our application with Scalar installed. Scalar is very easy to set up. It's just that one line of code if you want it to be. And then we can start working on the rest of it. So we get here, we're not launching by default, so I'm going to launch this. I get control and dot. And when I do, I get this, which is, hey, we don't have anything at that endpoint. That's not a problem because we're actually looking for /weather forecast. And we get, let's pre-print this, a number of weather forecasts, right? We can also go to Scalar /v1 and get, let's reset the view here. We can get the view on what our Scalar documentation looks like. There's our weather forecast. We can run a test request. We can hit send. There's the response we get back. Great. That gives us what we need to for our documentation for our site. We can also switch down here, lower left-hand corner, to the white mode, which is very bright. And we can also open an API client here. We're going to tweak this page. In fact, I'm not going to, I'm just going to move this off to the side. I'm not actually going to close down the page because I want to make some changes here. I'm going to save it, and then we're going to go back to the page and see the changes in action. So I'm going to say options, and then arrow and curly braces. And here we can set the options for Scalar. Now, first off, we come back over here. The page title says, if you can see that, it says Scalar API reference. I want to change that. So I'm going to say options.title equals, and we're going to say the sample API, which is the name of our site. Now, notice there is title, but there's also with title. They're two different things. You can do the same thing two different ways with Scalar. One is a more fluent way. One is just a property and a value. We're using the property and value here, so just make sure it's title, not with title. Now I hit save here. If we come back over here and we refresh the page, wait for it. Let's actually restart. I think it's not going to pull up the page title. So let's come back over here, refresh. There we go, the sample API. So it didn't pull the title because the title gets rendered initially and it didn't catch the hot reload. But now we see that the page title says the sample API, which is what we're looking for from our page title. Now let's address the theme. Now this theme, it's fine, but I don't necessarily love the light version of this theme. So what I'm going to do is, again, come back down here. We're going to say options.theme. We can say Scalar theme dot, and you have a whole bunch of options. They're pretty close. There's some different tweaks in here. I am going to choose to select Saturn. I kind of like that a little better for my dark theme. It's very dark, but then my light theme, it's more of a an off-white theme. I kind of like that a little better. So I think that's what we're going to choose for the theme. Now, the next one I'm going to show you, we're not going to change, but I want to show you it's possible. We can say options dot, and we're going to say layout. And there's two different layouts. By default, we have modern. We can also choose classic. If I were to choose classic, this is what it looks like. All right, this is the classic look for our layout, and it's if that works for you, great. You can also choose the light version of this or the dark. I don't love it. I want to do the modern theme, so we're going to make sure we specify the modern theme. But just note that setting is there, so now you can change it back and forth if you want. All right, last thing I'm going to tweak is actually down here in the lower left-hand corner, we see the Open API client. I don't want that button there. So I think it's confusing because if you ever wanted to go into something and say, hey, let's run a test request, you can still do that. But I don't want the Open API client button there. Well, you can turn that off. Options, hide client button equals true. We hit save, and now that button is gone. So now we don't have the option to open the client. There's not even a button here to open the client. It's just our documentation on this page and the test request. There's no open the client itself. Okay, so now you've kind of tweaked the layout for our Scalar page. Now let's talk about the rest of it. So let's hit stop here for a minute, and let's talk about some things I like to do because program.cs starts to expand. Like we've already seen with just a little bit of work here, program.cs is now 47 lines of code. Now we're going to get rid of most of it. In fact, let's do that just so you can kind of see the forest for the trees. Let's get rid of the things we're not going to use. And now we have an API that has no has no endpoint at all. So let's just say app.mapGet, and we'll say this is the root. And we're going to, for now, say something like hello world. Okay, so that's our root of our site now. We're going to adjust that in just a minute, but for now, that's our API. We're now at 25 lines of code. I prefer that, but even so, we've got some stuff like this where we've got a bit more configuration than I like to see in my program.cs. It kind of breaks us out of the flow of what's going on. So I want to make some tweaks to this in order to make it a bit more readable. And to do that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a folder. So I'm going to say this is the startup folder. Okay, and in the startup folder, we're going to create places for extension methods. Now let's start by creating one in here for our Open API. So we're going to call this Open API config. And in here, what we're going to do is make this a static class. And then we're going to create a method that is going to be add Open API services. So public static void, we're going to say add Open API services. And we're going to say this, and we're going to work off of this iServices, so iService collection. This iService collection, we'll call this services. And we're going to say services, if I spell it right, there we go, dot, and then we'll just say add Open API. Like so, which, yes, that's a one-liner, but we're going to put another extension in here, and then this file will contain all the configuration for Open API. So if you ever want to know, hey, where's that Open API configuration? Oh, it's in the Open API config file. So that's one thing we're going to do. Now, for right now, we're going to say add Open API services like so, and then we're going to add the using directive for that. So that just replace, one line replacing one line. You're saying, Tim, that's kind of, not really necessary. It's not. But at the same time, what this does, it puts it all in one place. And that way, if you ever want to add more services with Open API, we would do it here, and this wouldn't change at all. But we're also going to move this into its own for dependency injection, but we'll get there in a minute. Now, I also want to address this section right here, which we're going to work off of the web application. And so we're going to call this use Open API. So public static void use Open API, and we're going to say this web application. Notice I didn't make it nullable. So that's because by the time it gets to this line of code, even though this web application is nullable, when it gets here, notice it says app is not null here. So it already knows, hey, that's not going to be null. Now I can cut this out from here. I can come over here and paste it in the same code. It'll work the same way. But now I can say use Open API over here, app.use Open API. So now our program.cs is starting to be a bit more, we can get rid of the using directive for Scalar too, by the way. Our program.cs is starting to be a bit more readable because we have, add Open API services, we have build, we have use Open API, use HTTPS redirection. Then we have our mapping, which, yes, that's something else we have to address at some point, but that's it. So we've got a much simpler program.cs that's much more readable. I call this the quarterback method. If you're a U.S. football fan, the quarterback's kind of the person that calls the plays, that tells the rest of the team what to do, that's what's happening here. The program.cs is saying, hey, I want you to do this, and I want you to do this, and I want you to do this. So it's calling out the plays, and it's not actually doing the work itself. So that's what I want to see from my program.cs. We're going to continue to refine this and tweak this over time, just so you know. So we're going to add another file in here. Let's call this dependencies config. And we're going to do dependency injection in here. So we're going to say public static void add dependencies. And for this one, what I'm going to do is I could say it's an iService collection, but instead I want to go back one step further to Web Application Builder, just in case we have access to things outside of services. So I'm going to say Web Application Builder. This Web Application Builder, we're going to call it Builder. And yes, we have to make this static as well. In order to do that, your extension methods have to be in a static class. So now that I have this, I can just cut this out. Let's cut it out right here. Come over here and paste it in. And any other dependencies as well will go in this spot, which now means I can say that I want to say builder.add dependencies. And we're done. So this is dependency injection, add dependencies. This is use OpenAPI. This is mapping the HTTPS redirection, and so on. So we're starting to get now to a place where we have things in the right spot. We used to have what's called startup.cs, which was a separate file that had additional configurations, and they kind of merged that down into program.cs. And the reason why is because they felt like you didn't always need to have those two places. And in fact, if you really started to put too many things in startup.cs, well, it gets just as messy. You have to pull things out of there too. So why have two files that then you have to pull out of instead of just one? So they kind of consolidated it. But what we're doing is saying, yes, but we know we're going to go beyond the scope of what I really want for program.cs. Therefore, I'm going to create a startup folder that has all of my different startups options or configurations in there. So now we have things set up. We're going to address mappings separately. We're going to have a folder called endpoints. Let's just set that up for now. And so we're going to say endpoints, and let's call this root endpoint or endpoints, just so we have something here. And so we have the pattern set up. So now we're going to come over here, and we're again going to grab the web application, and we're going to say public static void add root endpoints. This web application app, like so. And then we can come over to program.cs, grab this, cut it out, paste it in here. It's our hello world, but it's set. And now we can say app.map root endpoints. Well, I have to, like so. And yes, add the using directive for it. Or if I didn't spell it right, add root endpoints. There we go. So there we go. So now we have our root endpoints in place. We have the using directive up top for it. We can close out of that error. So this is what our app's going to look like. And the program.cs won't change a whole lot. All right. We may add a couple of things in here in this section where we have the middleware, and we might add a couple more middleware pieces. But again, we won't add middleware directly here, or at least not eventually. So may put it here initially to make sure we test it, but then we will break it off into its own, either the endpoints folder or the startup folder have its own extension method class. That way our Program.cs is more readable, more manageable, and more kind of future-proof based upon what we're moving towards with this application. Let's test this to make sure it still works the same exact way. Now, we did get rid of the weather endpoint. So it's not like we're going to have the same endpoints as before, but now we have localhost where it says hello world. And then if we were to say /scalar v1, well, we do have a scalar endpoint, and we have our /, which we can test. And when we do that and hit send, we get back the plain text hello world. So that's working. It gives us back the data, but it is a pretty simple, pretty basic site. We're going to change this over time to be more useful than just this, okay? But that gets us started. Now, next up, what we're going to do is we're going to add sample data to this project so that we can have something to test. Now, the whole goal here is that you will have this API to run. Now, I'm going to put some sample data in here. I've already got a JSON file. We'll just load in with sample data from things I already use. But this will create for you something to test against. Now, eventually, like I said in the intro, we're going to load this into a Docker container. That way, if you use Docker locally, you can pull down my image and say, hey, run this API and run it locally and just test locally without having to have any connection to the internet. You can do it on a plane or on a train or wherever you are. Or you can go to a URL. And we're going to say, thesampleapi.com and get this API. Now, it's not there yet. We're going to get there once we get to the point of deploying this application to a VPS and also containerizing it and putting it on Docker Hub. So we'll get there. But for right now, the next step is going to be we're going to add sample data to this API. Until then, thanks for watching. As always, I am Tim Corey.